Lovely to see everybody here. This is our second iteration of the Edurio Book Club, where we are talking with somebody important who's published some recent exciting insights into education. And very, very happy to welcome Dr. Neil Gilbride to this conversation today. Thank you so much, Neil, for joining us and sharing some of your work.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. And excellent. And we'll be talking about Neil's book that was published very recently called Bandura's Self-efficacy Theory in Action. And I have it here, and Neil has it here. It's not the thickest of books, so it's a nice nice read for a couple of evenings. Although I found myself, wanting to go back through some of the sections and really, it's so packed with insight that you kind of want to you kind of phase out and apply it to your day-to-day. And it is written with the teacher in mind, but as a leader of an organization, it was as interesting for me to read about it in the context of working with colleagues or myself. So Neil, we're looking forward to the follow-up of self-efficacy theory in action in the workplace. I'm sure that will be as exciting. But before we get going in the discussion on the book, Neil, would you be able to briefly tell about your story? You've done all kinds of different things, and you've taught others how to teach. And you've now written a book. Can you talk about what led you to the point, and what prompted you to write the book as well?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. So where to begin? So I think when it came to why this book, what for me, and where the kind of my career journey has taken me to get to this point, I think when I come back to a lot of my activity, whether that's been as a practitioner, whether that was working in the third sector, which are families with children with profound and multiple learning disability, whether that was as a teacher, whether that's been as a kind of running master's programs at universities, or in the role that I currently have at Ambition, University of Worcester. And when I think about the research I've done, and indeed the studying I've done in and around psychology and human development, child and adult development, and the research I've done looking at complex kind of decision making in school leaders, I think there's a constant running theme or constant running motivation for me, which is how do we help people feel that they can make decisions for themselves and their communities? How do we help people get to that point? And that's that idea of agency. And very early on in my kind of emergent studies in psychology, I came across the self-efficacy theory, Bandura's theory, and that being its beating heart. Like, I think there's been quite a fair bit around self-efficacy. It's kind of dipped in and out of fashion in the last 30, 40 years. But of all those fashions, the thing that's always moved to the wayside is what it's trying to achieve. Its golden thread, its real central purpose, why Bandura has written this theory, his whole body of work, which was that goal in mind. It was helping individuals feel and know they have agency in their lives, that they can influence and shape the direction of their lives as they move forward. And whether that's been as a teacher, as an academic, as a researcher, I've found a lot of my themes, whether they've directly worked with self-efficacy or indirectly, come back to that point of wanting to help individuals grow toward feeling they can look at a situation and go, yeah, I can shape this, I can influence this, I can take this forward. And so when I spoke to Tom Sherrington about the opportunities in action series, I mentioned, well, why hasn't anyone done self-efficacy? This could be a really good one. And he went, well, why don't you do it? I was like, okay, yeah, sure, why not? So yeah, I really appreciated his sponsorship on the idea, and just putting me forward for it. So I suppose
that's how you get punished for good ideas.
Oh, well, I mean, it was a lot of fun to write, I have to say. It was really, and I think it, I think in every career you need to come back to your core purpose. What are you trying to achieve? Um, and for me, it helped to kind of coalesce for me, like what a lot of my work is trying to do, which is that people going into situations feel they know and feel they can do something about it, they can influence it, they can shape it.
Fantastic. And I think you summarized it towards the end when you said, Edurio has had a life of research and insights, and other people have around this as well. And obviously, not all of that is consolidated within this small piece, but it serves as a as an intro. And a lot of the people reviewing the book commented on how it kind of, there's stuff that feels seemingly obvious, but actually in some ways counterintuitive. And for me, when I was reading some of the case studies that you put together, I was reading the case study and I was saying, oh, this is a wonderful way to react to this particular situation. And then afterwards you dissect it and you say, how they missed out this opportunity, that opportunity, and then you go, oh wow, this is actually, obvious post factum, but it's so difficult to apply principles of listening and principles of not rushing in with our judgment. So yeah, it did you look for kind of elements that are counterintuitive, or is the theory kind of fundamentally such that it is takes a little bit of an extra leap to apply it?
So I think there's two things here. I think one of the powerful ideas behind this theory, and as an adult psychologist, I think one of the hardest things we can ask adults to do is to resolve tension, to resolve things that seem apparently paradoxical or sitting on different polar opposites, or force us to kind of go either one way or the other because one of the hardest things to ask adults to do is to integrate two seemingly different perspectives. And teaching asks, and running and working in schools, but the act of teaching asks us to do that a lot. How do we help individuals and maintain the whole group? Because many situations force us to divert toward one or the other. How do we provide meaningful direction and instruction whilst also enabling a growing sense of independence? These are two things that drive the traditional and progressive divide ultimately. And actually the probably sweet spot is in the middle, is the integration. And but the reason there is a binary is because adults find it very difficult to do. And so I think one of the most powerful things we can do is introduce theories that actually force us to integrate and help us to integrate different ideas. And I think self-efficacy does that. When we think about modeling, for example, modeling in the classroom, like if you're through a self-efficacy lens, if you're trying to raise someone's belief that their actions can lead to a positive outcome, you have to consider both the relational and the instructional. You have to integrate the two, and it helps you to integrate the two. So I think when it comes to kind of the idea of what this and what the case study is trying to do is to recognize that many of the acts of teaching are difficult. They're very easy to miss. And often a lot of the case studies are pushing toward one tension, and then the analysis pulls it back in toward the middle or the aspects out. So I think the case study around the teacher who went in with a real instructional mode but hadn't really weighed up the relational components, and why that, whilst it was instructionally beautiful from a self-efficacy perspective, would struggle. And what happens when you introduce a self-efficacy lens is it helps you to bring balance to both, bring balance to the force, as it were. I'll be trying to litter in little Disney references throughout this entire thing, having just come back. Yes, so that for me is that's what I was trying to do with the case studies, but also with the introduction and the power of the theory in itself, as it does help us to reconcile tensions that we often feel are factual, but they're not. They can be integrated, but they're hard to achieve. This theory helps us provide that bridge.
Fantastic. Okay, so we'll take a step back now, my encouragement to everybody on this call is we're going to talk through what is self-efficacy, and talk a little bit about the principles of it and some of the elements of it. We'll then talk about how Neil applies it to instruction, practice, and behavior in the book, and then we'll talk a little bit about moving beyond a teacher perspective, but moving to a school leader or system perspective, which I know many of you are working at that level. We'll talk about some of the challenges applicable to you in particular. My encouragement, in addition to you counting Neil's Disney references, which I will be attempting to do in the background, is to also feel free to add questions or comments from your work, or tensions that you see. We're keen to make this discussion inclusive to everybody here, and I'm always happy to have tons of questions that I'm eager to deep dive into. But please, at any point, feel free to use the chat to contribute to the discussion, or raise your hand if you want to come in on video and audio. So with that in mind, Neil, what is self-efficacy? Can you explain the concept to those who haven't worked with it as much?
Sure. So self-efficacy is the internal belief, so the belief that we hold that our actions in a specific situation will yield an expected positive outcome. So our actions, so our actions in a specific scenario, now that's critical. This is not a global, we're not self-efficacious individuals. We might be more or less likely as a trait to feel that we can do that, yes, but the self-efficacy is specifically tied to the situation in which is the individual's expected to act upon, and will yield some form of positive outcome. So it will lead to something which they and the external world determine to be successful. And that's the rub of it, really. Like, it's not confidence, it's not self-esteem. These are different aspects. These are more to do with different definitions and different ideas. But yeah, self-efficacy is that belief that our actions will yield some form of positive outcome or result in a specific situation. And
you mentioned, self-efficacy is not confidence because it is, specific to the situation. But as I was reading, I was pondering, what is the relationship between the two? Because, if you do make meaningful progress in maths and in English and in karaoke, then, you may find yourself more confident that you will apply, you will be successful in a new setting previously. That you haven't encountered before. Is confidence the collective noun for self-efficacies across various subjects, or is the relationship more nuanced?
I think it's really nuanced. I think for me that confidence comes from that overall feeling about ourselves, that overarching feeling of ourselves, our overall worth, our capability. It has a lack of a target. It's more focused on the perception people have of themselves across different contexts. And it was also, I would say, the phrase I use in the book, I think, is theoretically fractured. It means so many things to different people that when we're then trying to go, okay, raising someone's confidence, well, if we would then go into our toolbox of strategies and approaches, there's very little, it's very hard to prescribe or determine what specific sets of actions one could take that could reliably raise someone's confidence. Whereas self-efficacy, we do have specific actions that we can take that will raise someone's belief that their actions will lead to an outcome. Critically, confidence doesn't necessarily refer to action. I feel great about myself. Okay, now you can feel great about yourself and not act. But I think you're right to point out, and this is the beautiful flaw in all psychology, is we atomize psychology into boxes, as if they're all separate. but they are all deeply integrated. So even if you think about personality, like one of the key aspects of personality is openness to experience, right? That our openness to experience is probably going to affect the extent to which we're going to act. So at any one point, our willingness to act, our volition, is going to be impacted by a whole host of factors, including our general self-worth, our general self perspective. But equally, a person who is really confident in a specific situation might not be actually willing to act if it's particularly out of their comfort zone or particularly outside their set of experiences.
And it was interesting for me to think about, we say self-efficacy is specific to the task at hand, but that task is, often contains multiple elements. So, if you're going on if you're doing a task in English, that will contain, your reading, your literacy level, etc. But it may also include the ability for you to find information, etc. And by building self-efficacy, and that might carry over to a maths task, which also requires you'd finding information and developing. So is it fair to say that while it is specific to the task, that isn't always as simple as saying there is maths self-efficacy, there's physics self-efficacy? And
I completely agree. I think it's just we shouldn't assume that it should transfer. That's probably where I would go with it, is do not assume that and this is where a bit of common sense can be applied. For example, if there is a considerable overlap between tasks, then yes, absolutely. But I think the case study, for example, in one of the books is the example of, I think it was in a boxing kind of the sending. This was actually in a different role where there was an expectation that sending children to boxing classes would raise their confidence and therefore wanting to go into English and maths, and there is these things are so disparate. The idea of one's efficacy raising in boxing or a particular physical extracurricular activity transferring over to something that is so different is probably quite low. So I think what you've just described is the analysis of the different tasks and seeing to what extent they overlap. But then you have to proactively build that bridge. It's not fair to expect people to do that on their own. Just to go, oh, well, you've done something similar in the past is probably not going to be sufficient. You need to proactively build that bridge on a legitimate understanding those tasks are genuinely overlapping, rather than just expecting that it should transfer from one to the other by osmosis.
Thank you. And when you describe the concept, you introduce 4 key areas that underpin, the specificity to the behavior or domain. That's one of them. But you then have 2 that relate to the relation with the external environment. And one of them is a very simple sounding element, which is we learn from watching others. And the other is a very complicated sounding one, reciprocal determinism, that I'll ask you to translate into human. And can you talk a little bit about, why is the element of, the self and the environment important within self-efficacy, and how do how does that relate to the work that you've been looking at?
So I think a lot of Bandura's work, the self-efficacy being the most important thing, the deep fundamental assumption behind it is that we are neither puppets to the context and neither are we in complete control of our own destiny. That human performance, human identity, humanness exists in the interconnection between ourselves and our environment. And I think that is a very powerful message for an educator that has control of the environment, but also a powerful message in terms of how we understand agency. We often position the pinnacle of human action, whether you're a child or an adult, to be almost devoid of context. Regardless of the context, you can go in and you can act. that's just not how human in the world of Bandura, in the kind of this psychosocial idea of how humans are functioning, how we function the day to day, is that's ridiculous. The idea that we can act independent of our context. For the birds, we are deeply interconnected with our environment, and to the extent to which we experience agency will not just be determined on our own individual capacities. They are important, but the environment in which those capacities are situated within an expected form will shape the extent to which an individual feels that they can take decisions that best support themselves and their communities. Agency. And so for that reciprocal determinism, if we break the word down, reciprocal, one builds upon the other. The individuals build the environment, and the environment builds the individuals. And determined, the environment is determined by the individuals as the individuals are determined by the environment. It just goes around in this consistent, continual loop. And so, and I love that idea that we are held both, that human is an integrated form of both themselves and their environment. And what we see isn't just the individual act upon their environment, but their environment acting upon them. And it is both, and it is happening at the same time, and it's integrated. I think that's if we think, I look at behind you, kind of big questions around what does an effective education system look like? Well, one that recognizes that human endeavor, whether that is test scores, whether that is identity, personality of people we lead as well as the children, is as a result of the integration between the self and the environment.
Thank you. And this interaction, there's the internal and external, but there's also the loops within the internal that you talk about.
Yes.
In the book. And there is low self-efficacy means that you don't believe your actions will lead to a positive outcome, therefore you don't take the action, therefore you can't build agency, therefore you have low self-efficacy. And I really love, you don't use bold a lot in the book, but you use it in one place, which is that the real question of this book is how do you break that cycle of low efficacy and how you build that into a cycle of a spiral towards the positive outcome. How does for a child to break that spiral, to move into a positive spiral, is it a case of most work needs to happen at this initial point and then it becomes easier? Is that a continuous curve to move into a higher level of that curve? So can you talk a little bit more about that loop of agency, efficacy, and action?
So it is that self-fulfilling prophecy where action means if you succeed, you get the positive reward, the validation. And if you don't succeed, you get the feedback. You get that feedback. And if they've acted with intent, a genuine attempt to have a go, that feedback will mean something. That feedback will then give them the next step they need to take, which can then be successful. So we're constantly moving toward that success. What Bandura talks about is how those steps build. And for some individuals, those are smaller steps than for others that can take a bigger leap, bigger step, a more elongated step. And that's how we end up breaking that cycle, is we essentially look at the goal and we break that goal down into meaningful steps, progressive steps. We capture that progress, we showcase that progress, we make it obvious and apparent to that individual, but we only expect that step. And very often, I think an act of differentiation or inclusion by design, whatever phrase you want to attach to it, is what is it we want that individual to achieve against the broader goal? How does that situate against the broader goal? And to what extent do we make these steps bigger or smaller, more minute or longer, depending on that individual's, self-fulfilling cycle. If they're on a positive cycle, if actually they're building and building momentum, then you can make those steps higher and longer. Whereas if you're having to start, the point being is that they experience success. They experience success with you as a teacher. And part of the book, we talk about modeling, is when we talk about we learn from others, what makes us want to learn from others, that the person we're watching is we're not just looking at them and thinking, are we similar, but are they credible? Are they actually a credible source of instruction? Why should I adopt what is being shown to me if I do not believe the individual in front of me is to be credible? By credible, that I am going to listen to this person and I'm going to experience success.
And on the credibility point, one of the things that I found very interesting, and this is kind of going into one of the chapters where we talk about instruction, where you talk about credibility. You also talk about a teacher sharing a mistake they've made. And frequently within education, we have this image of the teacher being the infallible presence that can never be wrong, because that's how you demonstrate that your credibility. But you are implying that credibility stems from something else than just being always right. Can you share a little bit more about the sources of credibility for a instructor?
So, and I think it does depend on the group that you're working with, right? I mean, this is the thing, environment and individuals interact, which means we need to study our environment, and therefore what one group determines and look for in terms of credibility will be different. But in this case, and I'd say for the vast majority of classrooms, it is simply not credible to be right the whole time. And in fact, from a learning perspective, why do we give feedback? Because there's something to improve. There's something to improve. You are not completely correct. You made an error, or there was something you could improve. So I think when we talk about credibility, it's not a synonym for perfection. Credible is that they are so when we're modeling a mistake, okay, they've acted, they've taken an action, they've made a mistake, they've tried to correct that based on feedback. Oh, well, if they can do that, so can I. And therefore, what am I more likely to do? If I'm more likely to act, get the feedback and improve. And so the credibility of the person and of the model being presented and of the learning process, which is probably something I now reflect on, could have stressed a bit more, is that making that learning process credible. That you can make a mistake and improve your answer. And oh yeah, I'm so glad about that. I'm so glad I picked that up. Oh, okay, good for me. Well done. Gets individuals to act, are more likely to act, and therefore to receive the feedback to improve. And if we're thinking about those learners that do find learning more difficult and therefore more likely to make more mistakes and need that feedback sooner in the learning cycle, seeing that mistakes can happen and that be okay, increases the credibility of the instructor. And therefore I'm more likely to have a go. I'm more likely to do what they're asking me to do.
Yeah, and there is this element, a lot of the people in this on this call and that we know across the sector are working to solve or address the challenge of disadvantage and close the learning gap that exists. And I just finished another very powerful book called Poor by Katrina Sullivan, who talks about, she grew up on the frontiers of poverty, and she talks about some teachers that were massively inspirational to her. But you can also read throughout the book of how there's this kind of them and us. There's the tweed coats. There's the thick-rimmed glasses of the teachers who come from an extremely different background to some of the to a kid who's trying to get by school with junkie parents at home, etc. So how do you build this relationship and credibility when you're working with kids from some very challenging environments and difficulties at home, and where this breaking of this loop might be some of the most powerful thing that you can do as an educator?
This is where I think of anything. I mean, we know we're going to talk about scalability. I believe that there are certain ideas in the world that when you put them on your face like a pair of glasses, they fundamentally change how you perceive and therefore how you act. I'd argue one of those is complexity theory. I know we've talked about a bit of that in the past, where actually once you see and put your complexity lenses on, you fundamentally perceive the situation in a different way. And I think self-efficacy is the same. Self-efficacy makes us go, okay, what do they need? It's so that they can act and therefore increase their belief that their actions lead to positive outcome. They need to feel successful. So what should be the goal of my classroom is that they leave feeling more successful, like that actually they've succeeded in something. Now, if I am in a classroom where agency is particularly low, where they do not necessarily feel their actions are going to lead to a positive outcome, I'm going to need to start slow and low. Yeah, I know about the pressure of curriculum, but I'm not going to be able to meet those needs of the curriculum if ultimately they do not believe they're going to walk into my classroom and 50 minutes later, they have acted on something and that they have received some form of success, right? And so that building, and bearing in mind that the both that can happen at institutional level, it can happen at individual class level, where they're coming into school, coming into their environment, and that they are receiving the feedback that their actions are yielding some form of positive outcome. Okay, now, as we said, that's situation specific. So if we're thinking about low-income disadvantaged communities, which ultimately individuals have not really received a lot of feedback that actions yield to a positive outcome. And learning is incredibly risky. It's putting yourself out there. And the way our education system works is you're putting yourself out there against hundreds of thousands of other people because your grades are compared, and so that in itself is risk taking, right? So that idea of expansive experiences across a broad array of either subjects or kind of extracurricular activities becomes incredibly important because, as we now know, self-efficacy is situation specific. So we can't rely on just being very successful in English and maths and that translating across to others. That's not going to work. So if we're thinking about particularly disadvantaged communities, that making sure our classrooms and our institutions are enabling not just success within specific areas, but that success can be tasted across a broad array of different areas is going to be really critical and really important. And that's when we come back to the area of what we discussed earlier is what's the big goal? How do we build to those steps slowly and recognizing that for some individuals that will need to be small steps to begin with, because we need to engineer that, okay, I'm coming into that environment, I can act, and it will yield to some positive outcome.
And you talk in the book about the importance of setting goals. There's the example of, instead of cake, can you break an egg? Can you measure flour? Can you mix the two together? And what I was wondering, when you talk about goal setting, which actually mirrors quite a lot on what we do at Edurio, we set goals on organizational level, on department level. We try and keep ourselves to account and make progress. What I'd love to understand is it important for the learner to take any ownership of those goals as well? So is it okay for the school or the teacher to set those goals, or is it advisable for them to be co-constructed or built together to boost self-efficacy?
Oh, I'm going to say the classic psychological answer is it depends. Well, it depends, right? Because if you do not believe that ultimately your actions yield to a positive outcome, you are not going to set a very ambitious goal for yourself. And that goal might not actually reflect your actual capacity. The idea that, I wish our self-efficacy and ability do not correlate necessarily all the time. Like, we can have a huge internal capacity for something and not feel very efficacious. Like, they overlap, but they are distinct. And part of what I talk about in the book is the reason we build credibility is because sometimes we ask our students to take a leap of faith. That's our goal, ultimately. A classroom is, they're here, we need them here, and we get them to here. Like, ultimately, we're setting things that they can't do yet, right? So part of that, particularly when self-efficacy is low, is we need to take the reins but build the fact that we are asking them to take a leap of faith. And I think one of the case, I think it was in the case study or one of the parts of the book where I say we're ultimately saying just trust us for now, right? Act. Sometimes we need them to act when there's low self-efficacy. So we almost need the credibility act as a bypass. Look, I'm going to set this goal. These are the steps. We're going to make it really, really clear so that I know you do not feel that you can take these actions right now, but I'm going to have to ask you to take a leap of faith. And that's where that credibility in the instructors and the teachers becomes so, so important. Because if they do not perceive that individual as credible, they're not going to trust them. We talk about relationships, right? It's quite, the importance of student-teacher relationships. Then I go, yeah, but it's quite a vacuous concept, right? So we need to delve deeper into that. And what do we ultimately need? Then it goes to, okay, well, we need students and teachers to trust each other. Yes, but how do you get them to trust each other? You build credibility. How do you build credibility? That over time, a teacher says X and Y X happens. That's how we build credibility. That we in our transactions, we do what we say we're going to do. Even if we had doubt that it was going to happen. And so that's where the steps really matter. And so I'd say that co-construction can vary. Like, you've got an individual quite high self-efficacy, quite large considerable accurate self-awareness, like bringing that individual into setting the goal and the steps in a co-constructed form can be really useful. If someone's self-efficacy is low, which could affect the extent to which they set those goals and steps as to not being stretching enough, the instruction needs to build the credibility to begin with, but setting those steps quite low and saying, this is our big goal. This is how we're going to get here, bringing them into the conversation so they can see the steps, at the very least, making it explicit. This doesn't have to be the magic guessing game.
And I think you also talk about the importance of, the importance of the instructor to know what a good leap of faith is, that it's not too far of a leap. And I've felt this magical feeling of taking a leap of faith. I do bouldering, so climbing challenges, and when you can't do it for 5 times, and then you see somebody else do it, and then you kind of can figure out and do it, and next time it's suddenly easy, and every time you can do it, and there's this kind of belief in yourself that you can do it by seeing that other people like you can do it,
yes,
and that you can then replicate that once, and then you have confidence that you can do it. It's such a, it's an immediately visible difference, at least for me.
I'm so glad you stressed that, because that was something completely missing in my answer, and it is such a key part. Is actually, we do need others to show the way and to take the actions and show. And again, if we're talking about disadvantaged communities, there isn't a lot of these actions taking place in individuals they perceive to be similar to themselves. And so actually flooding the ground with different types of role models that can explicitly show the actions isn't, talk about motivational talks. It's not about motivational pep talks. And in fact, I come against those in the book. I literally say, like, motivational pep talk, nice story, great, but that doesn't necessarily map out the specific actions that I can take and the outcomes that they lead to. And if I'm trying to get someone to act, they need that. And so peers can be really powerful here. and how we leverage those environments strategically. Like, do we set up, when there are group activities, do we orchestrate those groups around, I've got this person here and this person here, and these two people are relatively similar ability, but these two aren't willing to act. What if I paired them together? And that's what I mean about the lens. That lens can mean that we look at how we set up groups differently, how we sit pupils together differently. Am I putting them next to peers where one can stretch upon the other? You know, role model. Just passively, as you said, like you'd sometimes just looking to the left and seeing someone similar to yourself, scaling up the boulders and going, oh, they can, let me just watch them for a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
it's seeing how much time we have. I wanted to ask a slight transition from, we've spoken about the learning of and self-efficacy impact on learning. The other element that you talk about, which I found very, very interesting, was the impact on behavior. So using self-efficacy as a tool to understand behavior. And behavior management is a polarizing topic in England. So I noted your caution around, saying that there are rules and rewards and sanctions, that this isn't necessarily for or against it. This is an additional lens. But it was interesting for me to read how you break behavior that is not disruptive behavior or non-disruptive behavior, that you are translating that into sort of behaviors or things that need to be learned and things that need to be developed. How much is that an element of the self-efficacy theory focus? Can you talk about how that relates?
So, I mean, this is what I tried to do at the start of the book, where it's trying to anchor it into its theoretical underpinning, where Bandura's ideas came around at a time where humans were either passive and just following reward and consequence, and they didn't do a lot of thinking, or they are individual and mini scientists in kind of Piaget mode. Bandura comes along and says, "Oh, it's probably a bit of both." And hence the idea that we're both ourselves and our environment interacting. And that's why it was really important to say, actually, rewards and sanctions do influence and affect a lot of behaviors, and they should always be your first line. Like, I get really frustrated and quite upset when children are, a year 2 child, my teacher talking to me saying, "Oh, this particular child won't come into the classroom on time. They're dilling and daddling around in the changing room and before coming into class. Is there a timer on the board?" No, they should just be able to do it. I'm like, most adults can't do that. Put a timer on the board, and if they don't respond to the timer, then we can then there's something to escalate. The timer sorted. Or do you need a physical cue? So rewards and sanctions are a critical part of your first line. And most children will react and respond positively to that, because we need our environments to guide our behavior. But if that's not happening, we then need layers of understanding that doesn't just drop us to, they are doing this on purpose and they are mean and evil and have no soul. Like it just kind of feels like they're not responding to reward and sanctions. What? Okay, they're here. There's actually a big thing here of, okay, there's underpinning psychological factors that could be affecting their engagement with these external constructs, and one of them is, I don't feel I can actually act on the rules. Like, if I do not believe that I can act in accordance with those rules, then I'm going to do things that ultimately I feel I can get efficacy boosts from. And so one of the questions in the book is actually trying to understand from the child's perspective what they are gaining from what they're gaining from that. What do they feel they're gaining? It might not be self-efficacy. It might be a plethora of different factors, but it's one that we should consider, is to what extent individuals feel, and indeed to how much we've set up their capacity to succeed in the environmental conditions. I'm not going to use the word rules, the environmental conditions in which we need them to enact. Because sometimes, I said, sometimes it comes down to the fact that there are things that they feel more efficacious in that happen to conflict with the environmental conditions that we need that in. We've set those we've said these are the environmental conditions, these are the rules. And human nature sometimes are dispensations, way we've acquired efficacy in the past. I think about one child in year 6 once who's making the transition to year 7. And you could tell this young lad was the cheeky chappy of the class, and that's where he got a lot of his efficacy from. Like, he'd smile when doing it, and he was managed in a particular way. But as soon as it came to a particular secondary, which had a very strict set, and it's not a criticism, where that was never really going to be entertained, he found this experience frustrating, because he's like, hold on, I felt efficacious in these classrooms, because this behavior, now it's not, and the behavior spiraled out of control, and etc. So it's just a lens to consider. Do the children actually feel they can enact these rules successfully?
And I mean, you spoke about something that I found very interesting, that frequently there's the front of the disruptive behavior, but underneath that there might be a plea for help, or a desire to become more efficacious along some of these behaviors, because there are real benefits. What I didn't see as much about is, frequently it is not cool to talk to the teacher about how do we improve the behavior. And so while there are all these listening techniques that you talk about, and ways to build that relationship, sometimes I imagine that's a frustrating experience, because the child doesn't show the willingness to participate in that conversation, or you have to kind of guess what their emotions are underneath that. How do you navigate that?
It's a great question. I think we have, so if I'm thinking the institution level, how are we helping teams and individuals to maintain a curiosity around the child, as opposed to a judgment? When things aren't working, or we've tried reaching out, it's not working, we maintain a curiosity, an open-ended curiosity. That's different to judgment. It's different to trying to resolve to find the answer. It's trying different lenses of which to maintain a curiousness around what could be driving that for that individual. If there are other individuals in the institution that are similar, if they belong as part of a group of individuals, I think there's a rush to resolve quickly. But with behavior, particularly if there's an underlying need, rushing to resolve can make us feel like we're acting, but ultimately not be improving the situation. And so I say in this, and particularly thinking of the individuals listening here, how are we helping both formally in terms of those processes of trying to understand psychological need, but also informally in things like line management meetings, like, okay, this child's not been resolved yet, why? As opposed to, okay, what support do you need to help understand this child better? We need to how do we understand this group better? So that's both the formal and the informal, in terms of enabling curiosity of when difference emerges. And having, and not just having self-efficacy in the toolbox, I would say, actually understanding the different other psychological factors that can affect when a child is not able to meet the environmental conditions that we're setting.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, we're now talking a little bit about already what we as school leaders can think about, or school group leaders, and I've got a couple of ideas that I wanted to just dive deeper into from a school leadership lens. And the first one we already touched a little bit upon is scalability, where a teacher has a class of 30 amongst many other classes of 30 that they're addressing, and they have a pupil that is needing certain amounts of scaffolding, certain amounts of modeling, certain ways to engage with. And their ability to engage with that individual pupil is severely limited for time and, you know, the curriculum pressures and all that. You know, how scalable is it? And are there schools that enable, you know, self-efficacy to be applied across the group? Are there techniques that you see schools or groups of schools employ that make it easier to apply at scale?
That's a really good question. I think the first thing around scalability is, are we actually at every level in the organization asking ourselves the question, do our classrooms, do our environments, do our teams enable individuals to believe that actions are going to yield a positive outcome? Let's just start, like, if anything anyone takes away from today is that question, just sitting on that question for a week and just watching and actually going around there, like, is this classroom, are we supporting classroom teachers with the instructional processes that enable them to help a wider range of children to feel that their actions will yield a positive outcome? You know, like, and so for a start, if we're talking about scalability, it's scalable in so much that just that question of itself will lead to us seeing practices and environmental conditions in a fundamentally different way, both with children and with adults. You know, you know, and that's important as well. Like, teachers don't feel efficacious. We're really expecting children to feel efficacious. You know, can they set the conditions and the environment for the children to feel efficacious? Probably not. You know, and when it comes to teaching practices, I think, and indeed behavioural practices, what I think a lot of the case studies try and do is force you to ask the other question. Okay, so the instructional is great. What about the relational? You know, with behavior, okay, rules and sanctions are being applied appropriately, yes, but that stubborn group of children, what's happening with them? What? Let's show a curiosity around that. And ultimately, I think a lot of the practices in the book, there's nothing I would say that is wholesale new. So if I take about the behavior example, you know, we're always going to intervene or try and do some of those interventional techniques like motivational pep talk, for example. Like, these things are happening on a day-to-day basis. It's not about not having that time spent. It's about swapping it for something that was more likely to work. And so when we talk about scalability, I think the first thing that any organization can do is just ask that question. You know, are we engineering our environments, classroom, team, whole school level, to work toward that goal? What goal are we working toward? You know, then in terms of those instructional practices, because so much of those practices leverage on what teachers are doing already, like teachers are modeling day to day. They're doing it every single day. It's just about asking different questions when we're modeling. Teachers set goals every single day. It's just about tweaking that process. Teachers talk to their students about behavior every day. Well, it's not about replacing that process. It's about making that a little bit more technically efficient, as it were, for want of a better term. These are things that we do day to day. It's just doing them with greater strategic intent around the goal of helping them to feel that their actions will yield a positive outcome.
And how much should students be aware of the theories of Bandura and self-efficacy? And if yes, at what age? So do you actually, you know, is it desirable to, you know, you talk about the importance of self-efficacy, or do we kind of trick them into learning without mentioning our methods?
I don't think we should be tricking them at all. I think we need to be as explicit as possible, like, and because that normalizes the process. You know, we don't need to, you know, teaching should never be a magic guessing game of, I know the answer, it's in my head, now come and guess it. You know, there is absolutely, how empowering can it be to a child that's 8, who you can see struggling and going, I don't think you believe you can act like this. So what's the first step that we need to take? What's the first step you feel you can take? Well, I'm not sure. Okay, well, I'd like you to try this step, just this step, and that's going to be our success for now, because I'm going to then ask you 3 more. You've introduced them to self-efficacy, the idea that their steps will help them to feel that they can act. We want individuals to feel I believe our end goal, whether we are supporting the professional development of teachers, school leaders, indeed any instructional activity, what is the actual goal? What are we actually trying to do? That people feel they can take decisions and influence the direction of their lives. If that's not what we're in the game for, I don't know what we're in the game for. Why are we giving powerful knowledge so people can take informed decisions for their lives? Why are we helping individuals to feel a greater sense of independence so they can take decisions for their own lives? That's the goal. And so when it comes to younger, it's about making the process explicit. But as children get older, let's develop their self-awareness through knowledge, and that knowledge can be some of the things that affects us is our belief that we can act. Let's show them that. I think it's really interesting. It's wonderful to hear people want to develop the self-awareness and the internal psychological capacities of young adults, which is fantastic. But often when I'm listening to those conversations, I then get quite frustrated because I'm like, well, what knowledge are you giving them to help them understand like themselves in relation to their world? And one of them is that, yeah, actually, you can sometimes go into one classroom and feel like you can take on the world and you can do anything that you're being set. And there'll be other environments where you don't feel that way. This is why. Oh, so it's not just me being ridiculous. No, it's not. And so I do think we need to think about, when we talk about personal development, I don't think we talk about self-awareness knowledge, not just of self, but the tools that we need to understand ourselves better. So yeah, I would be completely for that in that kind of scaled way, but at every level, making it explicit what we're doing with children, like I think can be very powerful on that journey.
Fantastic. Well, we have time just for one question, which Hannah has added in the chat, which is, do we feel that self-efficacy has changed? Are we in a low point of self-efficacy? Because it seems that there are challenges that exist across the sector that didn't before. Do you see any trends in this over time?
I think just remember, self-efficacy is specific. So I don't think there's any evidence per se, which, given the fact that there are self-efficacy tools out there that are pretty straightforward to use and don't need a lot of psychometric background to use them, like, although to understand them does, and that's where organizations like yourself do such important and very powerful work, Ernest, and I've said that about you for years. I think we have as now, particularly around special educational needs and disability and inclusion, do our teachers and do we as a sector feel efficacious that we can meet a wider range of need in our classroom? I think that the kind of without getting every teacher to do a self-efficacy test, I think it's pretty palpable that the sector as a whole does not feel necessarily efficacious in that task. And so I think that, and yet I do think that the knowledge is there. And so then we have to ask ourselves, where's the modeling? Where are we helping? And indeed, that I think is a really useful question, isn't it? Rather than how do we help children with special educational needs? What if we ask the question, how do we help teachers feel more efficacious that they can act and to yield a positive outcome in relation to special educational needs and disability and inclusion? And indeed, what if we could change that question to, how do we help our teachers feel that they can teach in a more wider range of complex circumstances?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Neil. To paraphrase the phrase of "it's turtles all the way down," it is self-efficacy all the way down. This is a book. You can order it from Dr. Neil Gilbride. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd have questions for another hour, but we will let you go back to your day-to-day now. Thank you so much, Neil, for joining, and thanks everybody.